In 334 BC, Alexander, king of Macedonia, began one of the greatest military campaigns in history against the superpower of the age, the Persian Empire. Just 20 years old, his brilliant and fearless leadership won him battle after battle. And in an astonishing 10-year campaign that took him to the edge of the known world, he carved out one of the largest empires ever known. Few men have had such a massive impact on the course of history. To the Persians, he was Alexander the Accursed, but to the West, he was immortalized as Alexander the Great. Ancient Greece. From around 500 BC, this rugged land was the scene of remarkable developments in art, philosophy, and warfare. Its two greatest city-states were Athens, a naval power where democracy, art, drama, and philosophy flourished, and Sparta, an austere, militaristic society famed for its formidable army. In 480 BC, these two city-states had joined forces to fight an invasion by the mighty Persian Empire. At the narrow pass of Thermopylae, a small Greek force led by 300 Spartans held up the enormous Persian army for 3 days, before they were finally encircled and killed. Then, in the Straits of Salamis, the Greek fleet defeated the Persian navy. But they couldn't prevent the Persians burning the sacred temples of the Athenian Acropolis. The next year at Plataea, the Greeks won a decisive land battle against the Persians and forced them to abandon their invasion. The next 50 years were the golden age of classical Greece. But rising tension between Athens and Sparta and their allies eventually led to war, dragging the Greek world into decades of destructive fighting. Wars between the Greek city-states continued for almost a century, leaving them exhausted and vulnerable to a new rising power to the north. For centuries, sophisticated Greeks had viewed the mountainous kingdom of Macedonia as a backwater, Hicksville, barely Greek at all. But under King Philip II, Macedonia emerged as a formidable military force. His most famous reform? The introduction of the sarissa, an 18-foot pike, twice the length of a normal Greek spear, and wielded by trained infantry fighting in close formation, known as a phalanx. In 338 BC, at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip's army crushed the joint forces of Thebes and Athens. Through alliance and conquest, Philip had already gained control over most of his neighbours. Now, following this victory, he united all Greece in an alliance known as the Hellenic League, or League of Corinth, with Philip as hegemon, or supreme commander. Only Sparta stood aside. Philip began to plan a great campaign, a pan-Hellenic or all-Greek war against the Persian Empire. Their old foe was now an ailing superpower, its great riches ripe for the taking. But on the eve of launching his war, Philip was assassinated by his own bodyguard, victim of Macedonia's brutal court rivalries. He was succeeded by his 20-year-old son, Alexander, brilliant, restless, tutored by the great philosopher Aristotle, and already an experienced military commander. Alexander inherited his father's grand plan to invade Persia, but first he had to secure his own position as king. At home, he had potential rivals executed, then crushed rebellions in Illyria, Thessaly, and central Greece. He made a special example of Thebes, completely destroying the ancient city and selling its people into slavery. In the spring of 334 BC, now ready to launch his war against the Persian Empire, Alexander led his army across the Hellespont into Asia Minor. It was the start of one of the greatest military campaigns in history. Alexander's army was about 40,000 strong, drawn from all parts of Greece. The infantry were commanded by the veteran Macedonian general Parmenion. In the front rank, 9,000 Macedonian phalangites, armed with the 18-foot sarissa. These were professional soldiers, well-trained and drilled, who formed up for battle in the phalanx, 16 ranks deep. This packed formation presented a solid wall of iron spear tips, and was virtually unstoppable. But it was also difficult to maneuver, and highly vulnerable to attacks on its flanks or rear. So 3,000 elite infantry, the Hydaspes, or shield-bearers, armed with shorter spears, guarded its flanks. They were commanded by Parmenion's son, Nicanor. The second line of Alexander's army was made up of 7,000 Greek allies and 5,000 mercenaries, armed as hoplites. They took their name from the hoplon, their large round shield, and carried shorter 8-foot spears. A hoplite phalanx was not as effective as the Macedonian phalangites, but still well armed and heavily armoured for the time. The Agrianes were the army's elite skirmishers, expert javelin throwers from what's now southern Bulgaria. Other skirmishers from Thrace and Illyria were armed with javelins, slings and bows. The shock troops of Alexander's army were the companion cavalry, 1,800 elite horsemen, armed with spear and sword, commanded by Philotas, another son of Parmenion. Alexander led the royal squadron in person. There were also 1,800 cavalry from Thessaly, commanded by Callas, 600 from other parts of Greece, led by Erigyeus, and 900 mounted scouts from Thrace and Paeonia, under Cassander. The great Persian Empire was divided into provinces, called satrapies. Each satrapy was ruled by a governor, or satrap. Those in Asia Minor, now threatened by Alexander's invasion, met to discuss strategy. Memnon of Rhodes, a skilled Greek general in Persian service, urged them to avoid battle with Alexander. Instead, he advised them to use a scorched earth strategy, to burn villages and crops and withdraw to the interior. Alexander's army, he promised, would quickly starve. It was good advice, but the satraps were unwilling to lay waste to their own provinces without a fight. So they decided to face Alexander's army at the river Granicus. The Persian army formed up behind the river, which was shallow but 60 feet wide with steep banks. Their front line was a wall of cavalry, about 10,000 horsemen from across the empire. Medes and Hyrcanians from modern Iran, Bactrians from Afghanistan, and Paphlagonians from Turkey's Black Sea coast. Behind, in reserve, were the infantry, several thousand Greek mercenaries, a common sight in Persian armies at this time. These men fought for Persian gold, and were armed with the round shield and short spear of hoplites. The Persians may have been unsure if they could trust these men in combat against fellow Greeks, and so placed them at the rear. Alexander, determined to attack and destroy this Persian force before it could retreat, raced to the Granicus with his best troops. On his left wing he posted Thessalian, Greek and Thracian cavalry under Parmenian's command. In the centre were the massed spears of the phalanx, its 6 divisions commanded by Perdiccas, Koinos, Amintas, Philip, Meleager and Crateros. On the right, Alexander himself with the companion cavalry under Philotas, as well as the elite Hypaspists, the Agrianes javelin throwers, and the archers. Alexander, with 13,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry in all, was probably slightly outnumbered. But ignoring advice to wait until dawn to cross the river, he ordered an immediate assault. He sent a squadron of companion cavalry to ford the river, followed by a regiment of Hypaspists and the Paeonian light cavalry. Alexander, calling on his men to show their courage, then led his right wing across the river. As they reached the middle of the river, the Greeks came under a hail of javelins, darts and arrows from the Persian line. Those that made it to the far bank were immediately charged by the Persian cavalry. Alexander was in the thick of the fighting. He attacked where the whole mass of their cavalry and leaders were stationed. Around him, a desperate conflict raged. Horses were jammed against horses, and men against men. The Macedonians striving to drive the Persians away from the riverbank. The Persians determined to prevent them crossing, and to push them back into the river. Alexander's attack seemed reckless, but he was buying time for the rest of his army to cross the river, including the irresistible Macedonian phalanx. Then, suddenly, Alexander was fighting for his life, charged by 2 Persian nobles. Roesaces rode up to Alexander and struck him on the head with his sword, breaking off a piece of his helmet. But the helmet broke the force of the blow, and Alexander struck him down with his lance. Then, from behind, Spithridates raised his sword against the king, but Black Clitus, son of Dropidas, anticipated his blow, struck his arm, and cut it off, sword and all. Now the Greek army was across the river, and the Persian cavalry faced a wall of Macedonian spears. Most turned and fled. The speed and shock of Alexander's attack meant Persia's Greek mercenaries hadn't even had time to join the battle. Alexander, in a blood rage, or possibly regarding these Greeks as traitors, ignored their appeals for mercy. the mercenaries were surrounded on all sides and massacred. Alexander had won a great victory. Asia Minor now lay at his mercy. But the Persian Empire was still a land of immense wealth and power. Already, it was mobilizing its vast resources to face him. If Alexander was to conquer this empire and take his place in history, he'd next have to face Darius, King of Kings himself. Now, as Alexander approached Sardis, capital of the Persian province of Lydia, its commander surrendered without a fight. But before Alexander could advance further, he needed to neutralize Persian naval power. Persia had a powerful fleet with major naval bases around the eastern Mediterranean that could potentially cut his lines of communication back to Greece. Rather than challenge the Persians at sea, Alexander decided to attack its nearest bases, the Greek coastal cities of Miletus and Halicarnassus. Both put up determined resistance, but were taken by winter. The following spring of 333 BC, Alexander continued his advance into Lycia and Phrygia. At Gordium, he was shown the legendary Gordian Knot. A prophecy said that whoever could unpick it would rule all Asia. Alexander simply took his sword and sliced it in half. Meanwhile, Memnon of Rhodes, a skilled Greek general in Persian service, led Persian warships into the Aegean and captured the islands of Chios and Lesbos. But after Memnon's sudden death from illness, the offensive was abandoned. "18 months had passed since Alexander's army crossed the Hellespont and invaded the Persian Empire. Now Alexander led his men into Cilicia, and was soon poised to cross the Nur Mountains into Syria. But then, the main Persian army, led by King Darius III himself, emerged behind the Greek army to the north. Darius was determined to trap and destroy Alexander's army, which he outnumbered almost 2 to 1. So he blocked Alexander's only escape route by moving his army to the coastal plain near Issus, just 6 miles wide, from mountains to sea. The narrow battlefield would force Alexander to fight, but it also prevented Darius exploiting his huge numerical advantage. His army, by some estimates, was up to 100,000 strong, and contained some of the finest soldiers in his vast empire, including 10,000 of his own household troops, known as the Immortals. His best cavalry were massed on his right towards the sea, where the ground was better for horses. His best infantry, his Greek mercenary hoplites, formed the center. Persian infantry formed his left wing. Alexander deployed his own army for battle, once again entrusting his left wing, nearest the sea, to Parmenion, with the Greek cavalry and infantry. In the center, as always, was the Macedonian phalanx. Alexander positioned himself and his best troops on the right wing toward the mountain slopes, his elite Agriane javelin throwers, his archers, and behind them the Hydaspists and the companion cavalry. When Alexander saw the strength of the Persian cavalry facing Parmenion on the left, he moved across his Thessalian cavalry to reinforce him. Despite his overwhelming numbers, Darius held his position behind a small river, the Pinarus, and waited for Alexander to attack. He didn't have to wait long. Alexander called out to his men, urging them to fight bravely, picking out some by name. Then evil power in the Mediterranean. But the island city of Tyre resisted. Tyre's defenders fought bravely and skillfully, even when Alexander began building a causeway to the island, protected by 2 giant siege towers, which they counterattacked with fire ships. But after 7 months, the city walls were breached and Tyre fell. Most of its citizens were killed or enslaved. Gaza, too, was taken by siege. Alexander continued to Pelusium on the Nile Delta, where the Persian governor of Egypt surrendered the entire province to Alexander, along with the royal treasury. At Memphis, priests of this ancient land welcomed Alexander as their liberator from Persian rule, and crowned him pharaoh. At the mouth of the Nile, he founded a new city, Alexandria, then travelled to the desert oracle of Siwa, where according to some accounts the priests welcomed him as son of Amun, king of the gods. Alexander returned east to Tyre, where in 331 BC he received news of trouble back home. Despite his great victories over the Persians, many Greeks regarded Alexander as a tyrant. King Agis of Sparta, with Persian support, now launched a revolt against Macedonia. Antipater, Alexander's commander in Greece, was already dealing with rebellion in Thrace. But he quickly marched south and met Agis in battle near the city of Megalopolis. Even the legendary Spartans were now no match for Macedonian military power. The Spartan army was crushed. King Agis himself was among the fallen. With his base in Greece secure once more, Alexander advanced towards the Persian heartlands, seeking a final showdown with Darius. He received a letter from the Persian king offering him a fortune in gold, his daughter in marriage, and half his empire in exchange for peace. But Alexander's stunning victories, all the oracles and acclamations, had now convinced him that his destiny was to rule the world. He rejected the Persian king's offer. He didn't want half the empire. He was coming to take it all. In 334 BC, Alexander, 21-year-old ruler of the small Greek kingdom of Macedonia, led an invasion of the vast Persian Empire. It seemed impossible odds. But thanks to Greek military dominance and Alexander's fearless leadership, he won 2 great battles against the Persians, at the river Granicus and at Issus. Having subdued Persian lands west of the Euphrates River, he now headed east into the empire's heartlands, seeking a final showdown with the Persian king, Darius III. Receiving news that a great Persian army led by Darius had assembled at Gaugamela, near modern Mosul in Iraq, he made straight for it. This was Darius' last chance to stop Alexander, and Alexander's chance to smash Persian power once and for all. Darius had chosen to fight on open ground, where his advantage in numbers would be more telling. His soldiers had also worked hard to clear and flatten the terrain, to make it suitable for Persian war chariots. By modern estimates, the Persian army was between 50 and 80,000 strong, and made up of contingents from across the empire. Infantry from Syria and Babylonia, cavalry from Armenia, India and Central Asia, up to 200 scythed chariots, even a handful of war elephants. Alexander's army was smaller, and may have been outnumbered by as much as 2 to 1. He deployed his units in their usual formation. On the left flank, Thracian and Thessalian cavalry, commanded by Parmenion. In the centre, the Macedonian veterans of the phalanx, each armed with their 18-foot sarissa pike. On the right flank, Alexander with his elite cavalry, the companions, and his best infantry, the Hydaspes. These were the units with which Alexander planned to launch his main attack. Greek hoplites formed a second line and supported both wings, which were angled back to guard against encirclement by the Persians. The battle began when Alexander led his wing out to the right, a move that took the Persians by surprise. Could Alexander really be trying to encircle their huge army? The Persians mirrored his movement, taking troops away from their centre to outflank Alexander and prevent him leaving the area they'd cleared for the Persian chariots. But Alexander's unusual maneuver was a trap to entice the Persians to weaken their centre. When he saw that it had worked, he ordered his Greek cavalry to charge, to keep the Persians fixed in position. A giant cavalry battle developed on the right wing. Darius, meanwhile, judging this to be the decisive moment, unleashed his chariots. Expert Agrianes javelin throwers took out horses and crews, while the Greek infantry opened lanes, allowing the chariots to pass harmlessly through. Now Alexander led his companion cavalry and parts of the Macedonian phalanx in a headlong charge straight at the weakened Persian centre, fighting his way towards Darius himself. The sudden ferocity of Alexander's assault threw the Persians into panic. The centre of the army broke and ran, King Darius himself leading the rout. But Alexander's left wing was in serious trouble. Parmenion, facing a huge onslaught by Persian cavalry, was virtually surrounded. Indian and Scythian horsemen had even ridden through a gap in the Greek line. But rather than wheeling and attacking the Greeks from behind, they'd carried straight on to loot their camp. Parmenion sent a desperate appeal to Alexander for help. The king abandoned his pursuit of Darius, regrouped, and charged the Persian right wing. hardest and bloodiest fighting of the battle, claiming the lives of 60 of Alexander's companions. Finally, as news of Darius' flight spread across the battlefield, the last Persian horseman turned and fled. The Battle of Gaugamela was a stunning and complete victory for Alexander. According to ancient sources, he lost just a few hundred men, while the Persians lost thousands. Alexander had routed Darius' great army. And now the road to Babylon, the empire's main capital, lay open. The Macedonian king entered the great city in triumph, recognized by Persian officials as its new rightful ruler. So too at the city of Susa, where Alexander ceremonially took his seat upon the royal throne of Persia. In the Zagros Mountains, at a pass known as the Persian Gates, a courageous Persian force held up Alexander's army for a month. The Greeks eventually found a mountain path that bypassed their position, allowing them to encircle and wipe out the defenders. In early 330 BC, Alexander reached Persepolis, the empire's ceremonial capital. Alexander wanted to appear as a liberator to the Persians, their posts. Then he resumed his march east, his goal to find and kill the usurper Bessus, subjugate the empire's eastern provinces, and reach the far edge of the world. In 330 BC, Alexander continued his march east. His goal, to find and kill Bessus, a Persian usurper claiming to be the rightful king, and to subjugate the empire's eastern provinces. Alexander headed first for Aria, today part of Afghanistan, where the Persian governor Satibarzanes had launched a revolt after initially pretending to submit to Alexander. The rebellion was crushed and Satibarzanes killed in single combat by a Greek cavalry officer. Nearby, Alexander founded the city of Alexandria Ariana, modern Herat, one of around a dozen cities that Alexander would eventually found, almost all bearing his name. Alexander marched on to Frada. The Macedonian court had a long tradition of plots and assassination. 6 years before, Alexander's own father, King Philip, had been murdered by his bodyguard. He was now informed that Philotas, commander of his companion cavalry, had uncovered a plot to assassinate Alexander, but kept it secret. Philotas and his father Parmenion were among the most respected of Alexander's commanders, and had played crucial roles in all his great victories. But when Philotas confessed, under torture, Alexander had him executed, then sent assassins back to Ecbatana, where Parmenion was governor, to kill him before he even heard of his son's death, and had a chance to turn against Alexander. In 329, Alexander resumed his pursuit of Bessus. En route, he founded the city of Alexandria Arachosia, modern Kandahar in southern Afghanistan. As he reached Kunduz, Bessus was betrayed by his own men and handed over in chains. Alexander sent him back to Persia for execution as a kingslayer. Alexander pushed on into modern Tajikistan, where the Sogdians rose up against him. He had to fight off attacks by local tribes and take several towns by assault. On the banks of the Jaxartes River, he founded the city of Alexandria Escate, meaning Alexandria the Furthest, so named because he had, at last, reached the limit of the Persian Empire. This frontier was frequently raided by nomads, known to the Greeks as Scythians. Alexander lured them into a decisive battle near the Jaxartes. The result was a crushing victory for the Macedonian king that put an end to the raids. But fighting against Bactrian and Sogdian tribes continued, frustrating Alexander and tying him down in a difficult guerrilla war. By now, many of the Macedonian troops were unhappy with Alexander. Most had not seen their homes in years, but their king seemed bent on conquest without end. What was worse, he'd begun to adopt the rituals and dress of their defeated Persian enemy, customs they viewed as effeminate and decadent. At Marakanda, modern Samarkand, after a furious drunken argument, Alexander killed Clytus the Black. Clytus had been one of Alexander's best generals, and the man who'd saved his life at the Battle of the Granicus. Alexander was full of remorse, but his growing arrogance was alienating more and more old comrades. When he tried to make his countrymen perform the traditional Persian ritual of proskynesis, prostrating themselves before the king, he crossed a line. To Greeks, this was blasphemy. Only a god was worthy of such respect, and Alexander was forced to back down. In Bactria, another plot to assassinate Alexander was uncovered. This time the ringleader was a royal page, one of the sons of Macedonian nobility who attended the king. Hermolaus had become murderously bitter towards Alexander over a perceived injustice. He and his accomplices were tortured and then stoned to death. Callisthenes, Alexander's official historian, was also implicated in the conspiracy. He was thrown in prison, where he later died. That summer, in 327, according to legend, Alexander became captivated by the beauty of Roxana, daughter of a Bactrian lord. Their marriage was also a sound political move, helping to end local revolt against his rule, and allowing him to continue his advance into modern Pakistan and India. Alexander now prepared to subdue the Persian Empire's most eastern provinces, which had yet to recognize his kingship. To do so, he would first have to cross the Hindu Kush mountains and reach the Indus River valley. Advancing in two columns, his army won a series of skirmishes against the Aspesi and Asakani as they fought their way into what's now the Swat Valley of northern Pakistan. After a fierce siege, Alexander took the Asakanian capital of Masaga. According to legend, it was ruled by a beautiful queen, Cleophas, who bore Alexander a son, and was allowed to keep her throne. The ruler of Taxila, near modern Islamabad, had formed an alliance with Alexander. Together, they marched to face Porus, king of Paravas, at the Battle of the Hydaspes. It was Alexander's costliest battle, as Porus's war elephants inflicted terrible casualties amongst the Greeks. But despite Porus's fearless leadership, the battle ended in a decisive victory for Alexander, winning him control of the Punjab. Alexander wanted to push on into India, to reach the great river, which ancient Greek geographers said formed the edge of the world. But at the river Hydaspes, known today as the Bias, his army mutinied. His men had marched thousands of miles, fought countless battles, and not seen their homes in 8 years. They'd heard rumours of gigantic armies waiting for them in India. They refused to go any further. Alexander was furious, but had to turn the army around. He followed the rivers of the Punjab to the sea, a journey that took 10 months. On the way, he defeated the Malians, but while leading the assault on their capital, was wounded in the chest and nearly killed. On reaching the coast, part of the army under Granicus boarded ships and returned to Persia by sea, sailing through the Straits of Hormuz and entering the Persian Gulf. It was one of the great ancient voyages of exploration, as these waters had been previously unknown to Greeks. Meanwhile, Alexander led the rest of the army back by land through the Gedrosian Desert, today in southern Pakistan. But extreme heat and shortages of food and water led to terrible suffering and many deaths among his army. On his return to Persia, Alexander executed several of his viceroys and governors, men accused of ruling unjustly and robbing temples and tombs during his long absence in the east. At Susa, he arranged a magnificent mass marriage of Macedonian officers to 80 Persian noblewomen to strengthen bonds between his two kingdoms. Alexander himself married 2 Persian princesses. He also paid all his soldiers' debts and ordered 30,000 youths from Alexander died undefeated in battle. His reputation as a brilliant, fearless and daring military commander remains undimmed. His decade-long campaign created one of the largest empires ever known, stretching from Greece to Pakistan. But it was vast and unstable, held together only by his own brilliance and name. Alexander left no plans for his succession, and his generals soon began fighting among themselves to carve out their own empires. In the Wars of the Successors, Alexander's widow Roxana and his young son were murdered. His own gold sarcophagus, en route to Macedonia for burial, was hijacked and ended up in Alexandria in Egypt. Today, its location remains one of the world's great unsolved mysteries. Few men have ever had such an impact on the course of history as Alexander the Great.